I don't even know where to start. I've been holding off writing this down, hoping that maybe time would blur the edges of what happened, make it less real. I keep waking up drenched in sweat, hearing those whispers, feeling the cold press of something I can't explain. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. Just me, my girlfriend Sarah, her brother Nate, and his fiancée Jess. A low-key camping trip in the Pine Barrens. None of us were hardcore outdoorsy types, but Nate had read about this spot online. A secluded clearing near an old hiking trail. Perfect for stargazing. We left early on a Friday, cramming our gear into Nate's ancient Subaru. The drive was uneventful. Winding roads, dense trees pressing in on either side, and the occasional dilapidated house or abandoned car. The kind of things you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. The trailhead was easy to miss. If Nate hadn't been looking for it, we would have driven right past the narrow path cutting into the woods. We parked, loaded up our gear, and started the hike. It was just over 2 miles to the clearing, but the woods were dense, the air heavy with the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're trespassing. We reached the clearing by mid-afternoon. It was perfect in a way. The tall pines formed a natural circle, their trunks impossibly straight, their tops swaying gently against the blue sky. The ground was soft with needles, and the clearing opened up just enough to give us a view of the sky. There was even a small creek nearby, the water clear and cold. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and by sundown, we were sitting around a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and joking about how we'd seen absolutely no one since leaving the car. But as the stars came out, the mood shifted. It wasn't sudden, not like someone flipping a switch. It was more like the shadows grew heavier, the air colder. I caught Sarah rubbing her arms, even though the fire was plenty warm. The trees seemed taller in the dark, their tops lost in the blackness. And then we heard it, a low, rustling sound, like dry leaves scraping together. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. No breeze. The sound came again, a little louder this time, circling us, though the trees didn't move. Probably just a raccoon, Nate said, though his voice was tight. Sarah frowned. Raccoons don't sound like that. None of us slept well that night. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart pounding, though I didn't know why. The fire was out, the clearing swallowed in darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to peek out of the tent. The forest was silent, no rustling, nothing. I must have fallen asleep again, but the next morning, Nate and Jess looked as rough as I felt. Over coffee, Nate admitted he'd heard whispers during the night. Like actual voices, he said. His hands wrapped tight around his mug. Same here, Jess whispered, her face pale. Sarah and I exchanged a glance. I hadn't heard voices, but I'd felt watched, like something was just outside the tent, staring. We should have left right then. But none of us wanted to be the first to suggest it. We spent the day trying to shake off the unease, hiking a bit, playing cards, pretending everything was fine. By late afternoon, the weirdness almost felt like a shared joke. The haunted woods, Jess called them, laughing as she threw a stick for Nate to fetch like a dog. But as the sun dipped below the trees, the feeling came back, heavier this time. The firelight didn't seem to reach as far, the trees pressing closer. The whispers started earlier, faint and far away, but unmistakable. Words we couldn't understand, spoken in voices that weren't quite human. And then we saw it, a shape moving between the trees. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, but it was too tall, too thin. Its limbs moved wrong, jerking like a puppet on strings. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. The thing circled the clearing, staying just at the edge of the firelight. It didn't make a sound, No snapping twigs, no rustling leaves. Just those awful whispers, growing louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Jess started crying. Nate grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for firewood, his knuckles white. And then the thing stepped into the clearing. It didn't look real. Its body was impossibly thin. Its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its face, God, I don't even know how to describe it. Hollow eyes that seemed to pull the light from the fire. A mouth that stretched too wide, full of teeth that were all wrong. None of us moved. And then it opened its mouth, letting out a sound that wasn't a scream or a roar, but something in between. Something that made my chest ache and my vision blur. Run! Nate shouted, and we did. We ran blindly into the trees, branches clawing at our skin, the whispers chasing us. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I'd see. I just held Sarah's hand and ran, the two of us crashing through the underbrush like terrified animals. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't let go of her hand. I couldn't let whatever that thing was catch up to us. Behind us, I could still hear it. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of something sliding, dragging through the forest. The whispers were everywhere, circling us, growing louder, like the trees themselves were speaking. The flashlight I'd grabbed in my panic bounced wildly, throwing chaotic beams of light against the trunks and branches. It only made things worse. Shadows stretched and twisted, shapes that looked too much like the creature flashing in the corner of my eye. Keep going, I choked out, my voice raw and trembling. Sarah didn't answer, but I could hear her sobbing, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Her hand gripped mine so tightly it felt like my fingers would break. A branch snagged my jacket, jerking me sideways. I nearly lost my balance, skidding on the damp pine needles. Sarah pulled me forward before I could fall, and I stumbled after her, adrenaline the only thing keeping me upright. Behind us, there was a crash, a heavy, deliberate sound. Whatever it was close, too close. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. It was there, just beyond the range of the flashlight's beam, moving in that horrible, jerky way. The way it leaned forward, its limbs too long and wrong, made me feel like I was going to throw up. Its hollow eyes caught the faint light, reflecting it like animal eyes in the dark. But they weren't right either. They were deep, endless, pulling at me, like if I stared too long, I'd fall into them. I turned back around and ran harder. The whispers changed. They weren't just noise anymore. They were words, or almost words, things I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. The sound pressed against me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. My chest felt tight, like the air around me had turned to water. Sarah was stumbling too, her breath sharp and shallow, but she didn't let go of my hand. Behind us, the whispers were changing. They weren't just voices anymore. They were layers of sound, overlapping, distorting, rising in pitch until they became a low, droning hum that made my teeth ache. It felt like the noise wasn't just around us but inside us, crawling under my skin and into my head. Keep going, I choked out, though it was getting harder to form the words. My tongue felt heavy, my throat dry and raw. Ahead, the trees seemed to lean in closer, their black trunks stretching impossibly tall, the gaps between them shrinking. The flashlight in my free hand was almost useless now, its beam barely cut through the shadows. Then I saw it, just ahead, past the tangled roots and underbrush, a sliver of pale light. The trail, the open sky, the car. It was so close, but it felt unreachable, like the forest was mocking us, dragging it farther away with every step we took. Sarah tripped, her grip on my hand slipping as she hit the ground hard. I whipped around, dropping the flashlight as I grabbed her arms, trying to haul her to her feet. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and dirt. "I can't," she gasped, shaking her head. "I can't." "Yes, you can," I said, though my voice cracked. "We're almost there." Something crashed through the woods behind us, louder than anything we'd heard before. A deep, guttural sound, like the groan of a dying tree mixed with a low growl. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Sarah got to her feet, and we ran again, our steps uneven and desperate. My legs felt like they'd give out any second, but the sound behind us was closer now, and that was enough to keep me moving. When we broke through the tree-line and into the trailhead, the car was right there, exactly where we'd left it, the sight so sudden and surreal it almost didn't feel real. "Get in!" I screamed, my voice ripping through the air. Sarah tore her hand from mine and sprinted to the passenger side. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them as my hands shook uncontrollably. My vision blurred for a second, whether from panic or exhaustion, I didn't know. The whispers were louder now, deafening, coming from every direction. I grabbed the keys, jamming them into the lock and yanking the driver's door open. Sarah was already inside, curled up in the seat, rocking back and forth with her hands pressed against her ears. I slid in and slammed the door, my fingers fumbling again as I tried to start the car. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. "Where's Nate?" Sarah suddenly cried, her voice shrill and shaking. I froze, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. My stomach plummeted. We had run so fast, so blindly, I hadn't even realized they weren't with us anymore. I turned to look back at the trailhead, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't Nate or Jess. The thing stepped into the clearing, its body framed by the faint glow of the car's headlights. For a second, it just stood there impossibly tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying us. Its body didn't make sense. The limbs were too long, the joints bending in ways they shouldn't. Its skin stretched tight like wet paper over bone. Its face, God, I can't forget its face, was smooth and pale, like melted wax, with two sunken pits where the eyes should have been. The whispers hit me like a wave, so loud now that I couldn't think, couldn't move. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerking and wrong, like it was learning how to use its limbs. "Drive!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. "Please!" I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the gravel before catching. The car lurched forward, and the thing disappeared into the blur of trees as I sped down the narrow road. I kept expecting it to lunge out from the woods, to appear in the rearview mirror, but the road stayed empty, the forest unervingly still. Sarah just stared out the window, her hands trembling in her lap. It wasn't until we hit the main road, the dense trees giving way to open space, that I finally let out a shuddering breath. I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. For a long time, we just sat there, the engine ticking in the silence. Nate and Jess never made it to the car. We waited for them on the side of the road for hours, even after the sun came up, but they didn't come. When we finally called the police, they searched the trail, the clearing, the woods. They didn't find anything. Not our campsite, not Nate's, not even a footprint. It was like none of it had ever been there. But I know what we saw, what we ran from. I don't know how to explain it to anyone else, though. I've tried, but the words always feel hollow, like they can't hold the weight of what happened. People just nod, offer polite sympathy, and move on, convinced we're exaggerating or misremembering. It's easier to let them believe that. But here's the thing, you don't forget something like that. You can try to push it away, tell yourself it wasn't real, that you were just tired or scared, but the memory doesn't fade. It sharpens, clings to you, follows you, changes the way you see the world. After that night, Sarah and I stopped talking about it altogether. We didn't even talk about Nate and Jess. There were no accusations, no breakdowns, just this suffocating silence that grew thicker every day. I think we were both waiting for something to happen. About a week after we got back, I started waking up at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. At first, I thought it was just my body reacting to stress, an internal alarm clock stuck on replay. But then I started hearing it. The whispering. It was faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like a draft slipping through a crack in the wall. I'd lie there in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear it, hoping I was imagining things. But it would grow louder, more distinct, until it was all around me, filling the room. It wasn't words, not exactly, but I could feel them in my chest, the way you can feel thunder before it hits. They weren't saying anything I could understand, but they weren't meaningless either. They carried a weight, an intent, and I knew it was the same sound we'd heard in the woods. I didn't tell Sarah. Couldn't. She was already pale and withdrawn, barely eating, her eyes sunken and ringed with shadows. She jumped at the smallest noises, flinched away from people who got too close. But one night, around 3:20 a.m., she shook me awake. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I didn't need to ask what she meant. I nodded, and the relief on her face was worse than anything else. She'd been hearing it too, but she hadn't wanted to admit it. From that night on, the whispering got worse. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd hear it at work, in the bathroom, walking down the street. Always faint, just out of reach, but constant. Sarah started hearing it too, even when we were together. We didn't talk about it much, just exchanged these haunted looks when it happened, both of us too scared to acknowledge how real it was. And then there were the shadows. A trick of the light, or maybe the aftereffects of not sleeping well. But the shadows moved. Not fast, not enough to be obvious, but they shifted in ways they shouldn't. I'd see them stretching along the walls, creeping into corners, slipping out of sight when I turned my head. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something taller, thinner, standing just out of focus. Sarah saw them too. "It's following us," she said one night, her voice barely audible. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the far corner of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It didn't stay in the woods. Came with us. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. We started sleeping with the lights on, not that it helped much. The shadows were still there, and the whispers never stopped. One night, a few weeks after the camping trip, I woke up to find Sarah sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. She didn't turn when I called her name, didn't even flinch. I got up and walked over to her, putting a hand on her shoulder. She was ice cold. "Sarah?" I said again, my voice shaking. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide and glassy, her face pale. "It's here," she whispered. I froze, my skin prickling. "What is?" She didn't answer. She just turned back to the window, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I looked outside, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet street, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then I noticed the shadows. The streetlights cast long, sharp lines across the pavement, but some of them didn't match. They moved when nothing else did, slipping and twisting like they had a life of their own. And then one of them looked up. I don't know how else to describe it. The shadow stretched, bending and contorting, until it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a shape, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that stared straight into me. I grabbed Sarah, pulling her away from the window, my heart racing so hard it hurt. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. I didn't have an answer, because deep down I knew it didn't matter. Wherever we went, it would follow.